The forest had always been a place I wanted to explore, a quiet refuge from the chaos of everyday life. I was never one for big crowds or noisy parties. The city wore me down, with its relentless buzz and the endless flicker of neon signs. So when I was offered a weekend trip to a remote cabin in the woods by my coworker, I accepted without hesitation. It was supposed to be peaceful, just a few days of fresh air, long walks, and starry skies. We left Friday afternoon, driving north along a winding road that grew narrower and rougher as we got farther from the city. Eventually, we parked at the edge of a dirt trail that led into the dense forest. The air smelled of pine and damp earth. Birds called overhead, and a gentle breeze stirred the leaves. My coworker Mike and I set off, backpacks loaded with camping gear, food, and a few bottles of water. The sun was still high, but already the shadows stretched long between the trees. The trail was narrow and rugged, twisting through towering oaks and pines. Every step felt muffled by layers of moss and fallen needles. As we walked, Mike told me stories about this forest, local legends, strange sightings, people who got lost and never returned. He laughed it off like a good joke, but the tone in his voice wasn't light. I could tell he'd heard things he didn't want to believe. The sun dipped lower and finally disappeared behind the hills. We reached the cabin just as the sky turned to twilight. It was a small, weather-beaten structure with peeling paint and a sagging porch, perfectly isolated. The only light came from the flickering flames of a small campfire we built outside. The first night was uneventful. We ate canned chili and drank coffee from a thermos. The fire cracked and popped, casting dancing shadows against the trees. I lay on my sleeping bag inside the cabin, listening to the sounds outside, the rustling of leaves, the occasional hoot of an owl. Around midnight, I woke to a noise. Something soft but deliberate, like footsteps crunching on dry twigs. I glanced at Mike, who was snoring lightly. The cabin was still except for that faint sound just outside. I got up and unzipped the door. A cold wind hit my face. I shone my flashlight into the darkness, but saw nothing. The noise stopped. I went back inside and tried to fall asleep again, but the feeling of being watched lingered. The next day, we hiked deeper into the woods. The trail grew steeper and less defined, and the forest thicker. Mike kept joking about the forest spirits, but I noticed he kept glancing behind us as if expecting someone, or something, to be there. By late afternoon, we found a small clearing with a shallow stream. We rested there, refilling our water bottles and eating granola bars. The sunlight filtered through the canopy, and the forest seemed almost peaceful. Then Mike pointed toward the trees on the far side of the clearing. "Did you see that?" he asked. I looked, but saw nothing. He frowned. "I thought I saw someone," he said. "Maybe a hunter or a hiker." We called out, but got no reply. Just silence. That night, the footsteps returned. This time they were louder and closer, slow, deliberate steps circling the cabin. Mike and I sat outside, firelight casting long shadows, weapons in hand, me with a sturdy hiking stick, Mike with his hunting knife. The steps stopped suddenly right on the edge of the clearing. Then we heard breathing, heavy, ragged, just beyond the tree line. We shone our flashlights into the darkness and saw nothing. Suddenly a low growl echoed through the trees, and the air grew thick with the smell of damp earth and something metallic. I could see Mike's face in the firelight, pale and tense. "Whatever it is," he whispered, "it's not human." The night dragged on. Every time the fire dimmed, the footsteps returned. Every time the wind shifted, we caught glimpses of movement between the trees, shadows darting just out of sight. At dawn, we packed up quickly and started the hike back, eyes scanning every direction. Halfway along the trail, Mike stopped and pointed to a tree. Scratched into the bark were deep, jagged marks. They looked fresh. Beneath them, words carved roughly. "Don't trust." I swallowed hard. We hurried the rest of the way to the car, the forest seeming to close in around us. When we reached the road, I looked back once. For a moment, I thought I saw a pale figure standing just inside the tree line, watching us go. I never camped there again. Months later, I read about hikers who vanished in that area. Their campsites found abandoned, their belongings scattered. No bodies, no explanations. Some say the forest is haunted by a presence that preys on loneliness and fear. Others believe it's something older, a force that guards the woods and punishes those who disrespect it. All I know is that when the wind rustles through the trees at night, I hear footsteps echoing softly in my mind, and I can still smell that cold metallic scent, like rusted iron and wet earth, lingering just beyond the edge of sleep. Story the end. The forest was supposed to be my refuge, a place to escape the noise of the world, to find peace beneath the thick canopy of towering trees. It had always been that way growing up on the outskirts of a small town. I was raised in a household where silence was rare, and the city's ceaseless hum felt like a weight pressing down on me. When I turned 27, I decided I needed to break away, even if just for a weekend. I packed a modest bag, grabbed my tent and sleeping bag, and planned to spend 2 nights deep in the woods of the national forest nearby. I wasn't an experienced camper by any means, but I knew enough to be cautious. I picked a spot that I thought was remote, far enough from the main trails and roads, beside a small creek I'd read about in an old guidebook. My plan was simple: hike in, set up camp, explore during the day, and return before dark on the third day. No phone service, no distractions, just me and the forest. The first day was everything I hoped for. The sun shone through the green leaves, birds sang in the branches, and the air smelled of pine and earth. The creek babbled quietly as I set up my small tent near its bank. I spent the afternoon wandering a little off the trail, careful to mark my path with small piles of stones. The forest felt alive but calm, a perfect retreat. That night, after cooking some canned stew over a small fire, I lay in my sleeping bag and listened to the forest settle around me. Crickets chirped, the wind rustled through the leaves, and somewhere in the distance an owl called out. I felt safe, wrapped in the quiet embrace of the woods. Around midnight, I woke suddenly. The temperature had dropped and a chill crept into my bones. I heard something. Footsteps, slow and deliberate, crunching on the forest floor outside my tent. My heart quickened, but I told myself it was just an animal, deer or maybe a raccoon, moving through the underbrush. The footsteps circled my tent once, then paused. I held my breath. Then came a soft tapping, like fingers drumming lightly on the tent fabric. 3 taps, then nothing. I lay frozen until dawn, clutching my flashlight and a small pocket knife. When morning light finally spilled through the tent's window, I stepped outside. The ground was undisturbed, no footprints, no signs of any visitor. I spent the second day trying to shake the unease that had settled over me. The forest seemed different now, too quiet, like it was holding its breath. I explored more, following an old logging road marked on the map, and found a clearing where wildflowers bloomed in profusion. But even there, the silence pressed on me. In the late afternoon, I found something strange. A small wooden carving hanging from a low branch. It was crudely made, a little figure with hollow eyes and a crooked smile. I had no idea who might have left it or why. An old superstition whispered in my mind, a warning to respect the forest's boundaries. I took a photo of the carving and left it hanging where it was. That night, the tapping returned. This time, it was joined by whispers, soft, unintelligible voices that seemed to come from all around. I unzipped my tent flap and shone my flashlight into the darkness, but there was nothing. No people, no animals, just trees swaying in the wind. I tried to convince myself it was the wind playing tricks or my mind overworked from isolation. But as I lay down, I realized I wasn't alone. Something was watching. At some point, exhaustion overtook fear, and I drifted into fitful sleep. I woke to a sound I will never forget, a low, guttural growl just beyond the tent. It was not quite animal and not quite human. It rumbled in the distance, then closer, as if something was moving through the brush, stalking. I grabbed my flashlight and unzipped the tent fully, ready to defend myself if needed. The beam of light cut through the trees but revealed nothing but shadows and moonlight. I called out, my voice trembling. No answer, only silence. I stayed awake the rest of the night, sitting by the dying embers of my fire. When dawn finally came, I packed quickly, eager to leave. On my way back, the forest seemed to shift around me. Paths I was sure I'd taken were gone, replaced by unfamiliar trails. The trees crowded in closer, branches clawing at my clothes. I found the wooden carving again, but this time it was on the ground, broken. Panic welled up inside me as I realized I might be lost. The map offered little help. The terrain seemed to twist unnaturally. I tried to retrace my steps, but the forest was like a maze. Hours passed. My water ran low, and my legs ached. Just when I was ready to give up, I stumbled upon a small cabin nestled between the trees. It was old and weather-beaten, with windows dark and curtains drawn. The door creaked open slightly, inviting or warning. I couldn't tell. I stepped inside. The air smelled of mildew and smoke. In the corner was a table with a candle, half burned and cold. A journal lay beside it, yellowed and brittle. I flipped it open, reading the faint scrawl of someone who had lived there long ago. The entries told a tale of the forest, claiming those who wandered too far. Strange lights, eerie voices, people disappearing without a trace. The last entry was a warning. If you hear the tapping, do not answer. If you see the figure in the woods, run. A sudden noise made me jump. Footsteps, heavy and slow, approached the cabin. I hid behind a broken chair, heart hammering. The door creaked wider, and a shadowy figure appeared, tall and impossibly still. It didn't speak, only stared with empty eyes. I waited until the figure left, then fled the cabin without looking back. When I finally broke through the tree line, the world outside seemed impossibly bright and loud. I called the park rangers and told them about the cabin and the figure. They searched but found no sign of the place. Locals said the cabin had been abandoned for decades, and no one knew about any figure. I never returned to that forest. Sometimes, when the wind is just right and the night is silent, I swear I hear tapping on my window. 3 slow, deliberate taps. And I know the forest still watches. Story the end. The wind was sharp as I parked my car at the edge of the forest, the late October chill seeping through my jacket. I'd been planning this solo trip for weeks, a weekend away from the city, a chance to disconnect and clear my head. The spot I chose wasn't famous or heavily trafficked. It was a stretch of dense woods a couple hours from town, known only to locals and a few seasoned hikers. I liked that it was quiet, unspoiled, untouched. The parking lot was empty when I arrived, the gravel crunching beneath my boots as I stepped out. My backpack felt heavy with the gear I'd packed: tent, food, water, extra clothes. The trees loomed tall and close, their leaves a patchwork of fiery reds and deep oranges. The forest smelled of pine and damp earth, the scent sharp and alive. I started down the trail, the path narrowing quickly into a rough, winding track. The sun was already low, sending long shadows between the trunks. The forest floor was littered with fallen leaves, and the occasional rustle suggested small animals moving just out of sight. About a mile in, I crossed a narrow creek. The water ran cold and clear, gurgling over smooth stones. I paused there for a moment, listening to the sound of the water and the quiet hush of the woods around me. A little farther, I found the clearing I'd been searching for. It was small, ringed by thick pines, and sheltered from the wind. A perfect place to set up camp. I worked quickly to pitch my tent and gather firewood. The forest was growing darker by the minute, the sky bleeding from orange to purple. I built a small fire and sat close, grateful for its warmth. Dinner was a simple affair, canned stew heated over the flames, but the taste didn't matter. I was content just to be there, surrounded by the deep silence. As darkness settled, the usual sounds of the forest started to fade. The birds stopped singing and the wind quieted. It felt as though the woods were holding their breath. Then I heard it, a soft tapping coming from just beyond the ring of firelight. At first, I thought it might be a branch swaying in the breeze, but the tapping was too rhythmic, too deliberate. Tap, 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 slow, steady, deliberate. I froze, shining my flashlight toward the sound, but the beam found nothing. The tapping continued, moving slowly around the edge of the clearing. My pulse quickened. I called out, "Hello?" My voice sounded strange in the stillness. The tapping stopped. The silence pressed in. Then the tapping started again, closer this time. Tap, tap, tap. I scanned the darkness with my light, heart pounding. I thought I glimpsed movement, something tall and thin standing just beyond the trees. The shape shifted, impossible to see clearly. Fear rooted me to the spot. I felt exposed, vulnerable. Then the tapping ceased entirely. I tried to steady my breathing and convince myself it was an animal or a trick of the light. I went inside my tent, zipped it closed, and lay awake for hours, the fire reduced to embers. At some point during the night, I thought I heard footsteps circling the tent, slow and deliberate, a faint rustling of leaves. Morning came with a dull gray light filtering through the trees. I emerged cautiously. The clearing looked normal. No sign of disturbance, but my backpack was moved slightly, the strap twisted oddly. I packed up as fast as I could and left the forest behind, the uneasy feeling clinging to me. Days later, I still felt watched, and sometimes late at night, I hear tapping. Story the end. The sun was just beginning to dip below the horizon when I parked my car at the edge of the forest trailhead. It was early October, and the air had that crisp, clean bite to it, the kind that feels refreshing after a summer spent in the city's heavy humidity. I was there for a weekend alone to escape the relentless buzz of life, to clear my head in the way only the forest can offer. I'd been hiking these woods many times growing up, but this is my first time camping solo in this particular stretch, an old-growth forest tucked away on the outskirts of town, where the trees grew tall and thick, and the underbrush tangled so tightly it seemed like it could swallow a person whole. The trail was narrow and rarely traveled, a detail I liked. Solitude was exactly what I wanted. I slung my pack on my shoulders and started walking. The path quickly narrowed under the dense canopy of pine and fir. With each step, the city faded behind me, replaced by the soft crunch of pine needles beneath my boots and the occasional chirp of a bird settling in for night. The woods were quiet, but not silent. There was a low murmur of wind rustling the leaves, the distant babble of a creek, the scurrying of small creatures unseen but very much present. About 2 miles in, I found a clearing I'd remembered from an old trip years ago. It was a small, flat spot near a creek, just big enough for my tent and a small fire pit someone had built long ago. The ground was soft with moss, and the smell of damp earth was comforting. I set up camp quickly, eager to get settled before darkness fully took over. As I built a fire, the sun slipped below the horizon, leaving only the fading pink light bleeding through the trees. The forest grew darker, shadows thickening between the trunks. My fire crackled and spat sparks upward, illuminating the small circle around me. I sat back against a log and ate the cold sandwich I'd packed. The woods were beautiful in this fading light, but there was a tension that I couldn't shake, a feeling like the forest was watching, waiting. It wasn't fear exactly, more an uneasy awareness that I was a visitor in a place that had its own rules. After dinner, I decided to take a short walk along the creek. The moon was just a sliver in the sky, but the firelight was enough to guide me back. As I wandered, the sounds of the forest seemed to sharpen, chirp of crickets, the splash of water, the distant call of an owl. But then, something changed. I stopped, hearing a soft rustling in the underbrush just ahead, but no wind stirred the leaves. It was deliberate, slow, and deliberate. I scanned the trees with my flashlight, the beam cutting through the darkness, but saw nothing. Then I heard a faint breathing, heavy and ragged, from somewhere close. It wasn't an animal. It was too slow, too human. My heart rate quickened and I called out softly, "Hello?" No response. The breathing stopped, replaced by silence so thick it felt like it pressed against my skin. I hurried back to my tent, zipped the door tight, and lay still, listening. Outside, the forest held its breath. Just as I was beginning to relax, the breathing returned, louder now, right at the edge of my tent. Then came a whisper, low and broken. "Not safe." I froze, every muscle tensed. The breath moved away, fading into the night, and the forest was still again. Morning light filtered weakly through the trees when I finally fell asleep. When I woke, the fire was just cold ashes, and near the tent flap was a single muddy footprint. Barefoot, wide, with long toes splayed deep into the soil, I packed quickly and left, never looking back. The forest had kept its secret. Story the end. The forest was supposed to be a refuge, a quiet place to escape the chaos of everyday life. I had grown up in the city, surrounded by noise, concrete, and the constant rush of people. So, when I got the chance to spend a week alone at a cabin deep in the woods of Maine, I jumped at it. The owner of the cabin was an old friend of my father's, and he'd offered it to me as a chance to get some rest and clear my head. I didn't tell anyone exactly where I was going, only that I'd be off the grid for a while. The first 2 days were everything I'd hoped for. The air was clean and crisp. The towering pines whispered with the wind, and sunlight dappled through the leaves in golden patches. At night, the forest was alive with the calls of owls and the rustle of small creatures moving through the underbrush. I spent my days hiking, fishing in the nearby stream, and reading old books by the fireplace. The cabin itself was rustic but cozy, with creaky wooden floors and a sturdy roof that had weathered many winters. But on the third night, everything changed. I had just settled in after a long day of hiking. The sun had dipped below the horizon, leaving the forest in near darkness except for the pale light of a waning moon. I was sitting outside the cabin, wrapped in a blanket, sipping coffee from a thermos and watching the stars emerge one by one. The night was calm and still, and the silence felt almost sacred. Then I heard it, a faint tapping, like nails against wood, coming from the edge of the clearing near the tree line. At first, I thought it was a branch knocking against the cabin, but the sound was deliberate, rhythmic, almost like a signal. I froze, listening closely. The tapping continued, slow and steady. My heart picked up. I grabbed my flashlight and scanned the trees, but there was nothing there, just shadows and the occasional flicker of leaves in the breeze. I called out softly, "Hello?" No answer. The tapping stopped. I told myself it was just an animal, maybe a woodpecker or a raccoon tapping on a hollow tree. I tried to shrug off the unease creeping into my chest. After a few minutes, I went back inside, locking the door behind me. Later that night, as I lay in bed, the tapping returned, only this time it was coming from the cabin walls, soft and insistent, like something was trying to get in. I sat up, heart racing, and switched on my flashlight. The cabin was empty. The tapping stopped again. I forced myself to calm down and lay back down, telling myself it was just the house settling or the wind playing tricks on me. The next morning, I decided to explore a little further along a trail that led deeper into the forest. I had a map, but the paths were faint and tangled, and it was easy to get turned around. About an hour in, I came across an old, broken-down hunting blind overlooking a small clearing. The wood was rotting, and vines crept up its sides. Inside, I found strange symbols carved into the wood, circles and lines that looked like some kind of primitive script. A chill ran down my spine. I took pictures with my phone, trying to convince myself it was just some kid's prank or an old hunting mark. But as I stood there, I caught movement in the trees beyond the clearing, a flash of pale skin just for a moment before it disappeared into the shadows. I called out, but no one answered. I hurried back to the cabin, trying not to look behind me. That night, the tapping came back, louder and more urgent. This time, it wasn't just on the walls, it was on the roof, the windows, the front door, like someone or something was trying to break in. I stayed awake until dawn, clutching my flashlight and listening to the sounds outside. When the first light came, I peered out the window. The forest was silent again, but the ground around the cabin was disturbed. Footprints circled the perimeter, barefoot, large, and oddly shaped. I took pictures, my hands trembling. The rest of my stay was marked by strange noises, whispers just beyond hearing, shadows moving at the edge of vision, the feeling of being watched even when I was alone. On my last night, I decided to leave as soon as dawn broke. I packed quickly and loaded my car by the light of a fading moon. As I started the engine and pulled onto the dirt road, I glanced in the rearview mirror and saw a figure standing at the edge of the forest, tall, thin, and impossibly still. I blinked, and it was gone. I never went back to that cabin. The woods still call to me sometimes, but I know now that some places hold secrets better left undisturbed. And sometimes, when the wind howls just right, I swear I can hear the tapping again. Story the end. The forest had always been a place of refuge for me, a quiet place where I could leave the worries of the world behind and just breathe. Growing up near a dense woodland, I spent countless hours wandering beneath towering pines and oaks, feeling the cool, damp earth beneath my boots and listening to the rustle of leaves and distant calls of birds. When I moved to the city for work, the noise and pressure became overwhelming, and I found myself longing for that quiet sanctuary. One weekend, after a particularly grueling week, I decided to escape. I packed lightly, just a tent, sleeping bag, food for 2 days, and a small flashlight. I chose a national forest about 3 hours from the city, a place I had explored before but never ventured too deep into. This time, I planned to hike far enough to camp out overnight, fully immersing myself in the wilderness. The first day of hiking was peaceful. The trail led me through thick stands of spruce and maple, sunlight filtering through the canopy in golden beams. Birds flitted between branches, and a small creek whispered nearby. I found a perfect clearing beside the creek, flat and sheltered by a ring of trees. I pitched my tent, built a small fire pit, and settled in for the night. As the sun dipped below the horizon, the forest transformed. Shadows stretched long and dark, and the chorus of daytime creatures gave way to the softer sounds of night. I cooked a simple meal over the fire, the flames crackling and popping, casting flickering light across the trees. I felt calm, almost meditative, listening to the gentle rush of the creek and the rustling of leaves. Later, as I lay inside my tent, I became aware of the forest's night sounds more keenly. The crickets chirped incessantly, a lone owl hooted in the distance, and somewhere a fox yipped. But then I noticed a new noise. Faint, irregular tapping, like someone lightly drumming on a tree or maybe knocking on a log. At first I thought it might be the wind or an animal, but the pattern was too deliberate, too rhythmic. I unzipped my tent a little to peer outside, shining my flashlight into the darkness. The beam caught the rough bark of nearby trees, the glint of leaves, but no sign of movement. The tapping stopped abruptly. I closed the tent and tried to dismiss the feeling of being watched. But the tapping returned several times through the night, always 3 taps in quick succession, then silence. The sound was never close, but always near enough to be unsettling. When morning came, I pushed the experience aside and set out to explore further. The trail grew wilder, less traveled. Ferns brushed my legs, moss grew thick on fallen logs, and the scent of damp earth was strong. I followed an old deer path, hoping it would loop me back toward my campsite. After an hour of walking, I came upon a strange sight. A small wooden carving hanging from a low branch. It was crude, about 6 inches tall, shaped like a human figure with exaggerated features. Its eyes were hollowed out and the mouth twisted into an eerie smile. The wood was weathered, dark with age. I stared at it for a moment, feeling an unexpected chill. Why would someone leave this here? I debated taking it down, but something told me to leave it. Instead, I took a photo and marked the spot carefully before continuing. The forest around me felt heavier now, as if the trees were closing in. That evening, back at the camp, the tapping resumed, louder and more insistent. It wasn't on trees anymore. This time it was on my tent's fabric. Slow, deliberate knocks that echoed through the thin nylon. My heart pounded as I unzipped the flap and shone my flashlight outside. Nothing but dark shapes swaying in the breeze. I tried to tell myself it was an animal or maybe a branch hitting the tent, but the sense of being watched grew stronger. Then I heard whispers, faint, unintelligible murmurs drifting on the night air. The voices didn't seem human, not quite. They were hollow, echoing as if coming from far away, yet right next to me. Sleep evaded me. I kept the flashlight in hand, listening and watching. In the darkest hours before dawn, I finally heard footsteps. Heavy, slow footsteps moving through the underbrush around my tent. They circled me, pacing steadily. I whispered into the night, calling out, but the only response was silence. Then came the tapping again, now directly on the tent wall beside my head. 3 sharp knocks. I froze, clutching my knife and flashlight, sweat cold on my skin. The night stretched endlessly. Eventually, exhaustion took over, and I drifted into a restless sleep. I woke with the sun pouring through the trees, warmth on my face, but no sign of anything unusual. I packed my things quickly, eager to leave. The hike back was disorienting. Trails I had marked on the way in seemed altered or gone. The forest felt like a maze. Branches snagged my clothes. The light dimmed under thick clouds of leaves. I kept my bearings, retracing steps carefully, but unease gnawed at me. Then I saw it, a small cabin, hidden in a hollow among ancient trees. I hadn't known there was a structure here. It was old and dilapidated, with boarded-up windows and a sagging porch. The door hung ajar. Curious and desperate for shelter from an unexpected storm brewing overhead, I stepped inside. The air was thick and stale. Dust motes floated in the weak shafts of light through cracks in the walls. Inside, an old wooden table sat beneath a small window. On it lay a faded journal. I opened it, revealing brittle pages covered in scrawled handwriting. The entries were dated decades ago and spoke of strange occurrences in the forest, disappearances, eerie noises, sightings of shadowy figures. One passage caught my eye. They come when the tapping starts. The forest whispers their names. We try to run, but it pulls us back. If you hear the taps, don't answer. If you see the eyes watching, don't stay. A sudden noise startled me. Footsteps, heavy and deliberate, outside the cabin. I froze, heart racing. The door creaked open wider. A dark figure loomed in the threshold, tall and silent. Its eyes glinted faintly in the dim light, empty, unrateable. I backed away slowly, my breath shallow. The figure didn't move or speak. After what felt like an eternity, it turned and vanished into the trees. Shaking, I fled the cabin, sprinting through the woods until the trees thinned and I saw the familiar edge of the forest. I didn't stop running until I was safely back in my car. Even now, weeks later, I sometimes hear tapping when I'm alone, 3 slow knocks on a window or door, and when the wind shifts just right, I swear I hear whispers, carried from somewhere deep in the woods. The forest is still there, waiting. Story the end. The forest had always been a place I sought for peace. Growing up on the outskirts of a small town, the woods were a refuge from the noise and the crowds. As a kid, I wandered those trails endlessly, learning the rhythms of the wild, where the birds nested, which plants were safe to touch, the way the wind whispered through the pines. But as I got older, the calls of the forest became less frequent. Life grew busy, complicated, and I found myself increasingly drawn to the bright lights and hum of the city. One autumn, desperate for a break, I decided to return to the forest alone. It was late October, and the maples and oaks blazed in reds and yellows, their leaves crunching underfoot like brittle glass. I wanted to spend a night deep in the woods, away from cell phones and electricity, with only the sounds of nature to keep me company. I packed light, just the essentials: a tent, some food, a flashlight, and a small first aid kit. I left my phone in the car, knowing the signal would be spotty anyway. The drive out was uneventful, the road narrowing and twisting until I reached the trailhead, where I parked my old truck. There were maybe 2 other cars, but nobody was in sight. The sky was bright, the air cool and crisp. I hoisted my pack and stepped onto the trail. The path was familiar in some ways, but the forest always felt different every time I visited. This time, the light filtering through the branches seemed muted, almost as if the trees were holding their breath. I brushed the thought aside and kept walking. The trail wound through thick stands of pine and birch, the ground littered with dry needles and fallen leaves. About an hour in, I reached the creek where I planned to camp. The water gurgled over smooth stones, clear and cold. I found a clearing nearby, just big enough for my tent, sheltered by tall trees. Setting up camp felt easy, even peaceful. As I stacked wood for the fire, I noticed a faint scent in the air, something earthy and sharp, like damp moss mixed with something else, maybe smoke, though there was no fire in sight. As the sun dipped below the horizon, I built a small fire, its orange glow flickering against the darkening woods. I sat close, warming my hands, listening to the night sounds, the hoot of an owl, the rustle of small animals. The woods felt alive, but calm. Then I heard the tapping. At first, it was so faint I thought it might be the sound of branches rubbing in the wind. But the tapping continued, deliberate and rhythmic, coming from just beyond the firelight. Tap, tap, tap. I froze. My heart thudded in my chest. I swept the flashlight beam over the trees, but nothing moved. The tapping shifted location, circling slowly around the clearing. I called out softly, "Hello?" No answer, just the tapping. I wanted to believe it was an animal, a woodpecker perhaps, but the pattern was too steady, too purposeful. Tap, 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 tap. Pause, tap, tap. I stood up, the firelight casting long shadows as I scanned the trees. Something tall and thin seemed to move just beyond the edge of the light. A figure maybe, but when I blinked, it was gone. The tapping stopped. A silence heavier than the night itself settled over the clearing. I felt vulnerable, exposed. I packed up the fire and hurried into my tent, zipping it shut with trembling fingers. Inside, the darkness felt thick. My breathing was loud in my ears. I tried to sleep, but the tapping returned, now softer, almost like fingertips brushing wood. I lay still, eyes wide open. Then I heard footsteps, slow, deliberate, circling the tent. I held my breath. The footsteps stopped. The silence stretched. At dawn, I dared to unzip the tent and peek out. The clearing looked empty, normal. But my pack was moved. One strap was twisted, and there were faint scratches on the fabric. I packed quickly, the forest no longer feeling like a refuge but a trap. On the drive home, my mind replayed the night's events, questions swirling. Who or what had been there tapping? Why did it seem to communicate, to watch? Weeks later, back in my apartment, I still hear the tapping sometimes. Soft, patient, waiting. Story the end. It was a late summer afternoon when I decided to go for a solo hike deep into the Pine Ridge Forest. The area was well known around where I lived. Not because it was popular, but because it was vast, dense, and had an unsettling reputation among locals. Stories about people hearing strange noises or getting lost weren't uncommon, but I was never the type to be spooked by campfire tales. Besides, I had been hiking and camping since I was a kid. This was going to be just another adventure. I started my hike just after noon with a light pack, water, some trail mix, a small first aid kit, and a flashlight just in case. The forest was alive with the summer sounds of birds and insects, the canopy above thick but still allowing dappled sunlight through. The trail was a narrow dirt path winding through towering pines and dense underbrush, marked by faded trail signs. I was following the trail that led to an old logging cabin that had been abandoned for decades, but was often a waypoint for hikers. The first few miles went smoothly. I crossed a small creek, stopped to refill my water, and enjoyed the peacefulness. By late afternoon, the sun was already lowering, casting long shadows between the trees. I decided to make camp near a small clearing beside the trail, close enough that I could hear the creek's gentle murmur. I set up my tent quickly and started a small fire. The smell of burning wood and the sight of the flickering flames were comforting. I ate a simple meal and took out my phone to check the time, 7:30 p.m. The signal was weak, but I could get a text out to my roommate, letting her know I was safe. As darkness fell, the forest transformed. The chirping of crickets became louder, and the occasional hoot of an owl punctuated the night. I lay in my sleeping bag, listening to these sounds and feeling more relaxed than I had in weeks. But then I heard it, a low rustling from the trees behind my tent. At first, I thought it was a deer or some small animal. The forest was full of life. But this rustling was different, too deliberate, too close. I unzipped the tent and shone my flashlight toward the sound. The beam cut through the dark, illuminating the rough bark of pine trees, but nothing moved. Just as I was about to close the tent, I caught a glimpse of something between the shadows, a figure, maybe 6 feet tall, standing still, watching. My breath caught in my throat. I froze. The figure was too dark to make out details, but it didn't move. After what felt like minutes, it silently vanished deeper into the forest. I sat there, heart pounding, trying to rationalize what I'd just seen. Could it have been a trick of the light? My mind playing games? But no, I was certain. I tried to sleep, but the quiet was shattered every few minutes by the rustling sounds, always just beyond the firelight. Around 2 a.m., the sounds stopped abruptly, replaced by an eerie silence. Then I heard it. The softest, almost inaudible whispering. It wasn't words I could understand, more like a murmur carried on the breeze. It surrounded me, coming from every direction. I felt chills run down my spine. I grabbed my flashlight and scanned the darkness, but nothing appeared. The whispering faded slowly, and dawn finally broke. Relieved, I packed up and started hiking out. But even in the daylight, the forest felt different, thicker, darker. The peacefulness was gone. As I walked, I noticed broken branches and footprints around the trail. Not animal tracks, they were too large and oddly shaped, with elongated toes and deep claw marks. The footprints led off the trail into the dense woods. I followed cautiously, curiosity battling with fear. The footprints ended at an old tree with strange carvings on its bark, symbols I didn't recognize, like twisted faces and spirals. Suddenly, a sharp crack behind me made me spin around. Nothing. I hurried back to the trailhead, feeling eyes on my back the entire time. I've never returned to Pine Ridge Forest since. Sometimes on quiet nights, I hear whispering on the wind, and I remember those glowing eyes in the dark. Maybe some places are better left alone. Story the end. It started with a broken heart and a full tank of gas. After a particularly bitter breakup, I decided to drive up north and clear my head, far away from the mess of my apartment and even farther from the texts I kept reading and rereading like they were some kind of sacred scripture. A friend of mine, Steve, had once mentioned a quiet, underused campground in the national forest up near the Oregon border. No cell reception, no people, just trees, rivers, and time to think. I didn't tell anyone where I was going. That wasn't on purpose. I was just in a kind of fog, moving through everything automatically. I packed food, water, a tarp, and a tent. I had no clue that I wouldn't sleep a full night the entire time I was out there. The forest was beautiful when I arrived. Tall Douglas firs stretched endlessly above me, their trunks straight as cathedral columns. The sound of birds and the wind moving through the trees made it feel like a place suspended in time. I was the only one at the site. A small fire ring and a wooden picnic table were the only signs anyone had ever camped there. I parked my car down a dirt path and set up my tent in the flattest spot I could find. The nearest town was a 30-minute drive back along a winding road, and even that town was barely more than a general store and a gas pump. That first day went by slowly. I didn't check my phone because there was no service, and even trying felt like a betrayal of the solitude I was supposed to be embracing. I hiked a little, ate some trail mix, sat by the river, and let my thoughts untangle. When the sun began to set, everything turned gold and soft and calm. I should have left after that first night. I woke up at some unknown hour. It was cold. The kind of cold that seeps into your bones, even inside a sleeping bag. The air smelled different, like wet soil and copper. I could hear something crunching leaves outside my tent. I held my breath and stayed perfectly still. Whatever it wasn't a deer. The footsteps were too slow, too deliberate. I told myself it was a raccoon, or maybe a bear. I lay there, gripping the small camping knife I kept next to my bag. The footsteps circled the tent once, then again. Then they stopped on the far side, near the foot of where I was lying. I don't know how long I stayed awake like that. Maybe an hour. Eventually, the sound stopped. I didn't sleep again that night. In the morning, I checked outside the tent. No tracks, no signs of anything. That almost bothered me more than if I had seen some. The soil was soft enough that even a raccoon would have left something behind. I should have left. But I was stubborn. I told myself I was being paranoid. I hadn't been sleeping well for weeks, and the stress of the breakup was probably just amplifying every sound, every thought. So I stayed. I hiked a different trail deeper into the woods, hoping to tire myself out. It was quiet, like the whole forest was holding its breath. Even the birds seemed to avoid me. When I returned to my camp in the late afternoon, something felt off. Nothing was stolen, nothing was broken, but my stuff had clearly been moved. The tarp I used to cover the picnic table had been unpinned on one corner, flapping slightly in the breeze. My firewood pile was shifted. The little folding chair I'd left by the river was now facing the tent, as if someone had sat there watching it. I forced myself to laugh. Maybe the wind had knocked stuff around, maybe an animal. Still, I made the fire bigger that night. I didn't feel like eating. I stayed up watching the shadows beyond the firelight, jumping at every twig snap. Around midnight, I finally crawled into the tent. I kept the knife next to me again. I listened to the silence and begged sleep to take me quickly. It didn't. Sometime later, I have no clue how long, I heard the zipper. Not my tent zipper. Something outside. A long, slow unzipping sound. I held my breath. Then a rustle. Then nothing. Just that same coppery scent in the air. I couldn't move. I wanted to scream, but all that came out was a shallow wheeze. My hand found the knife in the dark, and I clutched it so hard my fingers ached. I didn't sleep that night either. When the sky turned gray with morning, I finally emerged from the tent. I walked around my campsite slowly. No signs of anyone. Again. No tracks. Nothing disturbed. But this time I noticed something that hadn't been there before. A rope. It was hanging from a tree near the path I had hiked the day before. Not just rope, an old piece of nylon, like from a hammock, or maybe even a child's swing. But there were no trees nearby shaped for a swing, and no other campers. It looked weathered, like it had been there a while. But I hadn't seen it the day before. I was sure of that. I packed up that morning. I had only been out there 2 nights. It felt like a week. My hands shook as I folded the tent. I had a deep crawling sense that I was being watched, and not by something curious, something hungry. The kind of watching that makes your skin feel too tight. I got in the car and started driving down the dirt path toward the highway. The trees crowded close, their shadows stretching across the road, even in broad daylight. That's when I saw the woman. She was standing about 50 yards ahead, right in the middle of the road, wearing a white t-shirt and jeans, barefoot. Her hair was long and tangled. She didn't move, just stood there, staring at the car as I slowed to a crawl. My window was cracked open. I remember that. I remember how cold it suddenly felt, like the temperature dropped 10 degrees in a second. I wanted to call out to her to ask if she needed help, but something stopped me. Her eyes were wrong. I couldn't see them clearly, but I could feel them. They weren't afraid. They weren't grateful. They were empty, like looking into a well with no bottom. I went around her, drove up onto the shoulder, snapping over brush and rocks, and didn't stop. I kept my eyes on the road and my hands on the wheel. When I checked the rearview mirror a few minutes later, she was gone. I made it to the highway and drove 3 hours straight before stopping. There was a diner off the road where I finally parked and tried to catch my breath. I didn't go home right away. I spent the night in a motel near the state line, half drunk and with the lights on. Over the next few days, I kept trying to tell myself I'd imagined it all. Stress, exhaustion, grief. The brain does weird things in the woods when you're alone. But that doesn't explain the last thing. When I unpacked my gear a few days later, I found something in my bag that didn't belong to me. A child's shoe, small, muddy, and worn through at the toe. I stared at it for a long time. I hadn't seen or heard any kids out there. I hadn't been near anyone. I checked my car, my trunk, everywhere I could think of. No explanation. I still have it. It sits on a shelf in my closet. I don't know why I haven't thrown it away. I never went back to that forest. I haven't gone camping since. I still don't know what I saw or what was watching me. I just know it wasn't an animal, and it wasn't alone. Story, the end. It was supposed to be a quiet weekend, a much-needed break from city noise and screens. I'd been burnt out for months, and when my cousin Nick offered to take me to a secluded forest cabin he rented up north, I didn't hesitate. We were both outdoorsy types, and the idea of hikes, bonfires, and fishing on the nearby lake sounded perfect. What neither of us expected was that we would come back changed. We never talk about it anymore. Honestly, we don't talk much at all. We left early on a Friday morning, his beat-up truck loaded with gear. The road north started out as a highway, turned into cracked asphalt, then gravel, and finally a dirt trail that led deep into the forest. This was real wilderness. Towering pine and spruce trees flanked the narrow road, and cell reception had vanished hours earlier. Nick's cabin wasn't really a cabin. It was more like a hunting lodge, one of those structures built decades ago by men who vanished into the woods for weeks at a time. There was no electricity, just a wood stove, oil lamps, and a hand pump for water. The nearest town was about an hour's drive back the way we came, and even that was just a gas station and a few shuttered buildings. When we pulled up, everything seemed normal, quiet, peaceful. The air was cold and fresh, and the scent of pine was strong. I stepped out and stretched, the long drive leaving my joints stiff. The silence was deep, almost heavy. No birds, no rustling, just stillness. "Too quiet," I muttered, rubbing my arms. Nick gave me a look. "You've been in the city too long," he said, slapping my back. "This is what quiet actually sounds like." We unpacked and settled in, chopping firewood, lighting the stove, and filling jugs of water. That first night was uneventful. We made dinner, drank a couple beers by the fire pit, and sat under the stars. The sky was a sheet of darkness scattered with constellations I hadn't seen in years. The crackle of the fire, the smell of burning logs, the occasional hoot of an owl. It was perfect. At some point, maybe around midnight, I got up to take a piss near the edge of the woods. As I stood there, the hairs on my neck stood up. I felt watched, as if something in the trees was observing me. I turned, scanning the dense blackness between trunks, but saw nothing. Just that deep, unnerving silence again. Back inside, I told Nick about the feeling. He brushed it off, said it was probably a deer, or maybe just the wilderness playing tricks on me. I let it go. We were exhausted, and after a few hours of tossing on the creaky bunk beds, I drifted off. The second day we hiked for hours, following a worn trail that looped around a marshy lake. Midway through the hike, Nick pointed out something odd. Clumps of hair stuck to a low-hanging branch. They were long, tangled, and dark, almost like human hair. But there was too much of it. I reached out to touch it, then stopped. It felt wrong. Nick squinted at it and shrugged. "Could be a bear rubbing itself," he said, though he didn't sound convinced. As we kept walking, we saw more. Not hair this time, but stacked rocks, little piles like cairns, some shaped like stick figures. Dozens of them, randomly scattered off trail. Nick laughed nervously and said it was probably some local artist or a bored hiker. I agreed, but I didn't like it. There was no sign anyone else had been out here in a long time. The ground was untouched, no footprints, no discarded wrappers or gear. It was pristine. That night, the wind picked up. The cabin creaked and tree branches scraped the roof in a slow, unsettling rhythm. I couldn't sleep. I kept thinking about those hair clumps and the rock figures. Sometime around 2 or 3 a.m., I heard a sound, not the wind, not the forest. It was a faint tapping, slow, deliberate, almost like fingers drumming on wood. I sat up, heart pounding. Nick was asleep in the lower bunk. The tapping continued. I grabbed the flashlight and got up, tiptoeing toward the front door. I flicked the light on and opened it slowly. No one was there, just the darkness of the forest. But as I scanned the tree line, I saw it. Movement. A shadow, something tall, humanoid, stepping back behind a tree. I froze. My light beam caught nothing but bark and needles. Still, I swear something had been standing there, just watching. I shut the door and locked it. Woke Nick up and told him what I saw. He didn't laugh this time. His face went pale, and he didn't try to reassure me. He just stared at the door and muttered, "We're leaving in the morning." Sleep was impossible after that. When morning came, we packed fast. Nick wanted to be gone before noon. As we were loading the last of the gear into the truck, I noticed something nailed to a tree about 15 feet from the cabin. I walked closer, confused. It was a deer skull, bleached white with holes drilled into the sides, and what looked like pieces of hair tied around it like some kind of charm, the same kind of hair we'd seen in the woods. I called Nick over. He stopped cold when he saw it. "That wasn't here yesterday," he said. We left without another word. The truck rumbled back down the dirt trail, but it felt like something was following us. At one point, I glanced into the woods through the passenger window and thought I saw someone running, fast, parallel to us. A flash of a grayish figure, long arms, something unnatural about its movement. I didn't say anything. I didn't need to. Nick's knuckles were white on the steering wheel. We didn't speak again until we hit asphalt. Back in the city, we tried to shake it off. Nick canceled the rest of his booking at the cabin. A week later, he sold his truck, said he kept hearing noises at night and wanted to get rid of anything that reminded him of that weekend. I started having dreams. Not just nightmares, vivid dreams that felt more real than waking life. In the dreams, I was standing in the woods again, but it was wrong. The trees were taller, twisted. The sky above was always dusk, and there was no sound, just the feeling of being hunted. I would turn in slow circles, heart racing, as something moved just out of sight. Sometimes I saw the figure, long and pale with hollow eyes. Other times I only felt it breathing behind me. Then came the knocks. Not dreams. Real. 3 soft knocks on my apartment window at night, even though I live on the 3rd floor. The first time it happened, I convinced myself it was a bird. The second time, I sat up in bed and saw a silhouette outside the glass. A head, elongated and misshapen. It didn't move, just stared. When I found the same kind of stick figure from the forest tied to my balcony railing the next morning, I called Nick. He answered immediately, like he'd been waiting. I told him everything. He said it happened to him too. The dreams, the knocks, the figure. A week ago, he woke up to find muddy footprints on his bedroom floor. No broken window, no open door, just the prints leading in and out of the room. He'd been sleeping with a knife under his pillow since. We decided to meet up, talk it through, maybe find someone who knew about folklore in that area. But the day we were supposed to meet, Nick didn't show. I called him over and over. No answer. That night, I got another knock at the window. And the next morning, I found a small deer skull on my doorstep. I haven't seen Nick since. His number is disconnected. I filed a missing persons report, but the police said there was no sign of him at his apartment. It looked like he just left. I haven't gone back to the forest. Never will. But sometimes I dream of it. And when I wake up, I can still smell pine, damp earth, and something else. Something sweet and rotting. Every few weeks, another charm appears. Hung from a nail, slipped under my doormat, left on my windshield, always made of hair and twigs. I don't know what we disturbed out there. But it followed us back, and it's still watching. Story the end. It was mid-October, that weird stretch between the end of summer and the start of real cold, when the trees are mostly bare, but a few cling to gold and brown leaves like they're in denial. I was driving up north to clear my head. I'd just been through a bad breakup, and I wasn't in the mood for city noise or people asking how I was. My family owns a small cabin deep in the woods near the border of Michigan and Canada. No cell signal, no neighbors for miles, just pine and silence. The cabin wasn't anything fancy, just four walls, a fireplace, a wood stove, and a little generator for light. I brought enough canned food, water, and firewood to last a week. My plan was simple: hike during the day, read at night, and sleep when I could. The first 2 days were peaceful, almost boring. I hiked out past the tree line, found old animal trails, followed deer prints, saw an eagle once. Nights were quiet. The wind blew through the trees, and I slept like a log. On the third night, I was woken up by something. At first, it was just tapping. I figured it was a branch or maybe a squirrel on the roof. I rolled over and tried to go back to sleep. Then I heard it again. Tap, tap, tap. It wasn't fast or rhythmic. It was spaced out. Intentional, like someone knocking softly. I sat up in bed and listened. It came again. Tap, tap. I looked at the door, then the window. My bed faced the single-pane window on the east side of the cabin. Moonlight trickled through just enough to show the outline of trees. The knocking was coming from the window. I didn't move. I just stared, listening. It was slow, deliberate tapping on the glass. Not forceful, just barely there. I felt the hair on my arms stand up. My heart pounded like it was trying to get out of my chest. I finally worked up the courage to slide out of bed and tiptoe toward the window. I didn't look directly out. I stood to the side and peeked from the corner. There was nothing there, just the tree line and shadows. I waited for a while, then went back to bed, convincing myself it was a bird or the house settling. The next morning, I went outside, looked around the window. No tracks, no marks, nothing. It was frosty, and I could see my own prints in the dirt and grass, but nothing else. Still, I felt uneasy. I hiked anyway, further than before, trying to shake the feeling. The air smelled clean. The silence was the kind you only get in places far from towns, cars, and voices. But I couldn't stop thinking about the tapping. That night, I fell asleep with the flashlight in my hand. It was quiet at first, the wind through the branches, the faint creaking of the old cabin walls. Then around 2 a.m., it came again. Tap, tap, tap. Not from the window this time, it was the front door. 3 knocks, slow and low, like someone barely touching wood with their knuckles. I froze. Tap, then silence. I waited, listening so hard it hurt. I clicked the flashlight on and pointed it at the door. Nothing moved, no shadows, no sound. I walked over and locked the deadbolt, though I was sure I'd already done it. My hands were sweating. I didn't sleep the rest of the night. I sat in the chair by the fire, flashlight in one hand, a hatchet in the other. The knocking didn't return. At dawn, I went outside to look. Again, no tracks, no signs, nothing. I was angry with myself for being scared. I told myself it had to be an animal, maybe the wood expanding and contracting, but deep down I knew it wasn't. I thought about leaving that day, but I was stubborn. I didn't want to admit I was spooked by the woods. I stayed. That evening, it started to snow. Not heavy, just a soft dusting that stuck to the branches and roof. It made the world feel more muffled, like everything had been padded with cotton. I made a fire, heated some soup, and sat close to the flames. At some point, I dozed off in the chair. I woke to the sound of footsteps on the porch. They were soft but unmistakable. Crunch, crunch, crunch. Someone walking across snow-covered wood. I held my breath. The fire had gone out, and the cabin was pitch dark except for the dim glow of the generator light in the kitchen. I didn't move. The steps stopped just outside the door. Knock. Knock. A pause. Then something even worse. The handle turned. It twisted slowly like someone testing it, seeing if it was unlocked. I had double locked it this time. The knob jiggled, then stopped. I stood and moved silently to the door, not making a sound. I didn't turn the light on. I just stood there listening, barely breathing. More footsteps, this time moving away. I waited 5 full minutes before I dared look outside through the peephole. Nothing. The snow on the porch had been disturbed. I could make out the indentation of several steps, but they ended at the stairs. No trail, no return prints, just steps leading up to the door and then nothing. The next day, I packed. I was done. As I loaded the truck, I kept glancing around the trees. I'd never felt like I was being watched before, but now I couldn't shake the feeling. I didn't take the usual road out. I took the older logging trail to shave time. That was a mistake. About 5 miles down, the truck started sputtering. I had 3/4 of a tank. The engine made a choking sound and died. I tried to start it again. Nothing. I checked the hood. I'm no mechanic, but everything looked fine. I waited a few minutes and tried again. It coughed, started, then died again. I was stuck. I grabbed my pack and decided to walk. There was a ranger station about 7 miles south. If I made good time, I could reach it before dark. The forest was quiet, too quiet. No birds, no wind, just my footsteps. I walked fast, watching the shadows stretch long. Every so often I'd glance back. I don't know why. I just felt like I should. That's when I saw him, just off the trail, maybe 30 feet back, between the trees. A man, still as a statue. I stopped dead. He was tall, wearing a dark coat, and I couldn't see his face. His head was slightly tilted, like he was curious. I stared and he didn't move, didn't flinch. I turned and walked faster. My heart hammered. I didn't want to run, I don't know why, maybe pride, but I picked up speed. I didn't look back until I got to a bend in the trail. When I turned, he was gone. No sound, no footsteps, just gone. I ran after that. By the time I saw the ranger station, the sky had gone deep orange. I pounded on the door. No answer. I tried the handle. Unlocked. Inside, it was empty. It looked like it hadn't been used in months. Dust covered the floor. The radio was dead. I checked the cabinets, old canned food, expired medical kits, but no recent signs of life. I barricaded the door and stayed the night. I didn't sleep. Every sound made me jump. At one point, I heard movement on the roof, light steps, then scratching, then nothing. At sunrise, I started walking again. Took the south road. By noon, a local hunter found me. He drove me into town, where I called a tow. When I told him what happened, he just looked at me. He said, "You're lucky you left when you did." I asked him why. He hesitated. "There's stories," he said, "about people staying too long in those woods, seeing things, hearing things. Some don't come back." I wanted to laugh it off, say it was all in my head. But then he said something that still gives me chills. "They always talk about the tapping," he said. "Starts soft, real soft, like someone asking to come in." I haven't gone back since. The cabin's still there, probably falling apart. My family asks if I'll ever use it again. I tell them no, because sometimes at night, when it's quiet, I think I hear it again. Tap, 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 soft, patient, waiting. Story the end.